Hello, I'm Aaron Pritchett, and welcome to this special edition of Newport News in Review, August Floods 2012. Last month, Newport News experienced a weather event that no one could have ever predicted or prepared for. The city residents and many businesses are still recovering. On this special edition of Newport News in Review, we look at the numbers, the events, and the consequences. We'll hear from our city manager and the director of Public Works and Engineering, giving us a clear picture of what happened and how the city responded. Those affected by the floods and those worried about the future need to stay tuned.
This is Newport News in Review.
I'm Patrick Rocky, Chief Meteorologist with News Channel 3. During the weekend of August 25th, Newport News experienced a rain event that was unprecedented. During that Saturday morning, one thunderstorm dumped more rain than any hurricane in our lifetime, with the exception of Floyd. Localized rain measured at street levels totaled in some places almost 10 inches in just 24 hours. And then over the next 3 days, Newport News had another 6 inches fall on top of an already saturated ground. This type of deluge in such a short time can create catastrophic results. If you add the storms from Saturday through Tuesday, the total rainfall in parts of the city exceeded Floyd. The other factors are the period of time over which the rain fell, the ground saturation, and the impact of tides, and how the runoff is halted or even reversed by tidal flows during high tide, especially when we have east or northeast winds blowing. As you can imagine, the City of Newport News had to marshal all its resources to respond to this challenge. Here's City Manager Neil Morgan.
On Friday night, August 24th, the National Weather Service predicted a 60% chance of showers and thunderstorms in Newport News on Saturday, with possibly up to 1 inch of rain. I woke up at 5 a.m. Saturday morning listening to the pouring down rain, turned on my computer, looked at the radar. It looked like a tropical storm moving over Newport News, and I knew we were in for a tough day and a tough period of time. With me today is Reed Fowler, the Director of Public Works, and Everett Skipper, the Director of Engineering. We want to talk for just a few minutes about how we responded to the storm and what some of the issues and challenges facing the city staff have been, equally challenging perhaps to some of the things that you experienced as a citizen. Reed, I want to start with you. Your department has operational responsibility to respond to flooding and drainage problems and to maintain the existing stormwater drainage system. Would you tell us a little bit about what happened on Saturday morning when we got that deluge, how you guys geared up and sort of how you've responded?
Well, like you, I kind of woke up to the storm. Was surprised by the amount of rain that we had. Our crews pay very careful attention to the weather forecast because that's part of our business. When I woke up around 6 o'clock, it was raining pretty hard, and checked with one of our lead supervisors to see if they had somebody out working, and they were just starting to mobilize crews. And the way they usually operate is we have 3 crews that are pretty continuously on call on the weekends, and those crews know to mobilize as soon as it starts raining. And that was their first response. But when we found out or discovered how hard it was raining for how long, it was a pretty intense rain, and it looked like it wasn't letting up at all. We called in additional crews. So the first response is always to put the crews in the field and begin to look at the drainage system from the standpoint of, are there any blocked grates, are there any blocked bar screens, are there any blocked inlets anywhere in the city that we can help to open up initially.
And you guys have a long list of places to check in that kind of situation, kind of traditional problem areas. That's the first place you go. Are bar screens blocked? Are low-lying areas? Is there anything clogging up the system, that kind of thing?
So we deploy to those places first because we know if there's an inrush, they kind of call it the first flush of rain, and when that occurs, just a large volume of rain and debris go to those bar screens, and so they check them to make sure they're clear.
Now, obviously, by later in the day Saturday, sort of the immediate crisis was over. By that time, we were getting lots of calls and emails about problems. You pretty much mobilized the stormwater staff. How did your public works response shift from the crisis of Saturday morning to the rest of the week?
Well, initially we received, in fact, over 200 calls on that day. And our job is to make sure that those calls are logged correctly and the crews understand that they need to check every call. One thing I always fret about is that when a crew begins to go out into the field, that they don't just go to a site and say, you know, the system's taking all it can.
Nobody wants to hear that.
So their job is to check every system and make sure that it really is functioning. And that's kind of like the initial response. In this particular case, because of the volume of calls, we decided to do kind of a triage operation. And the way we are, and that is still going on, and the way we're operating that is that a supervisor, both from Public Works and from engineering, are visiting with every customer. And their job is to get an understanding, you know, from the customer perspective, what the problem was in the field. So they kind of get the first-hand experience from the customer, and then they decide what other kind of triage units they need.
We have authorized overtime for your crews to take advantage of all the daylight to work on these problems as we work through the backlog. I'd like to shift to Everett. Everett, while Reed's operational people have the kind of initial response to attack whatever problem or challenge they face, engineering plays an important role that involves understanding how the system is supposed to work, figuring out things that could be done longer term to make the system work better, setting standards for private development, and also perhaps understanding and maybe having the burden of explaining to people why some things work and some things don't work or can't be done. Would you talk a little bit about your role both in the crisis of the great August 25th storm and after that, and perhaps in particular this issue of how tidal surge interacts with stormwater runoff and how that causes a special problem in some places?
Well, our first reaction on Saturday morning was that we knew that Reed and the entire city would be facing some very significant challenges. The city operates on the same design standard that the region and the nation do, which is about 6 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. And the worst peak of that design is about 2 inches in an hour. As you've seen from the numbers, the storms that we experienced were far in excess of that. And even in the areas where a properly designed and fully functional system was in place, we were sometimes overtaken and flooded. That means then that anything that wasn't functioning as it should, for example, if there was some debris that had accumulated somewhere that we weren't able to get to promptly enough or that occurred during the course of the storm, then that may have created additional flooding as well. The storm surge question that you raised, we live in Tidewater, and all of our drains go to the rivers and to the bay. And when those water bodies are rising, it can slow down the water that exits from our drains. Now, even if the drain is submerged, as long as the end that the water is coming into up in our neighborhoods is higher, the water still flows, but it doesn't flow as easily. So it's slowing down our ability to move water away. And that can sometimes create additional issues if we're getting significant rainfall. All by itself, storm surge can create flooding. If we look at certain of the maps that FEMA has provided for us, there are areas within the city that will flood simply from lakes and rivers rising.
Everett, you also mentioned the 6 inches and 24-hour standard. That's the current standard that you would require for new development. But much of the City of Newport News was built 50 years ago or longer. So to be clear, some of the neighborhoods that have this flooding do not have that 6 inches and 24-hour standard. Isn't that correct?
Historically, as 3 inches or even less in 24 hours was used as design standard, depending on the location. And there are a number of areas of the city that predate those regulations. So a large part of the city is not designed to the current standard.
Yeah, I've lived here off and on my whole life, and I don't ever remember Lyons Bridge being overtopped in a rainstorm like we saw Saturday morning. And then, of course, as everybody in town knows, particularly in the southern half of the city, Tuesday night was just a backbreaker when we were still recovering from Saturday's deluge. some parts of the southern part of the city had almost as much rain again before we had finished the recovery. Reed, I want to shift back to you. Folks hear about our finances and freezing positions and limiting resources and things like that. I wanted to make sure folks understood that we have not skimped on stormwater even during these difficult times.
About 15 years ago, we had one singular crew that managed stormwater and wastewater. And it's always difficult when you're trying to juggle kind of the priorities for those two organizations at the same time with the same people and with the same equipment to be responsive. So about 10 years ago, we split those two groups, and stormwater now stands on its own. Back in those days, we had 3 drainage crews that covered the whole city, cleaned ditches kind of on an as-called basis as opposed to a preventative maintenance scheme. Very little or, if any, inspection of kind of the underground infrastructure at that time. But since then, we've added 3 more crews, so we have 6 crews doing nothing but routine maintenance in the field. 2 bar screen crews who routinely clean and maintain the number of bar screens that we have, and they're up in the hundreds now. And preventative maintenance crews that look at that underground stuff so that we're televising, we are inspecting, reporting, and then planning capital projects. And Everett, of course, helps us with that when it comes to designing the capital work. But definitely a more proactive and preventative maintenance program as opposed to the way it was in the old days.
So the bottom line is, from an operational standpoint, we have more resources and we put more effort into stormwater management today than we did a decade ago or 15 years ago, despite some resource limitations. In Everett, I believe I know from my own experience, and you could certainly comment, on the capital project side, the City of Newport News has not skimped on drainage capital projects in recent years.
Oh, absolutely not. We've been investing between $3 and $7 million a year in various stormwater-related capital projects. And the way those come about most commonly is we review the flooding patterns, if there were any. In many years, we've had droughts lately where we didn't see any significant flooding, but we've also seen flooding at various times, even in what seemed to be a dry year. So we're reviewing what's been flooded, issues of how the system is operating. Of course, Reed is working on the maintaining of the system, but if the system is well maintained and something is still flooding, then engineering will be looking at what caused that, how did it occur, what can be done to improve it. Generally, there's 2 ways that we can deal with stormwater issues. We can either store the water, which means creating either wet or dry ponds, or we can move the water away, which means adding new pipes, new ditches, drainage ways. And sometimes it gets very complicated because when you add the new ditch, you carry it away to someplace else that isn't able to handle it.
That's pretty key to note, because a lot of times I think it's misunderstood that if you fix just one part of the system, it's going to fix somebody's front yard problem. But as you just said, it takes the whole system analysis to decide exactly where you're going to work.
Well, to wrap up this segment, in my personal experience, I've lived here most of my life, I don't think in some parts of the city we've ever had so much rainfall over a period of days like that that's had such an impact on so many people. You guys see it any differently?
No, we'd have to agree completely. The residents who lived near Lake Maury reported that they had never seen the dam overtopped the way that it was, and clearly that was a very significant event. And from the engineering perspective, what we'd like is to remind everyone that there is risk with all storms of the potential of flooding. The things that we do can help to mitigate, but cannot prevent it. And while we'll continue to work on those issues as rapidly as we can, using all the resources that are made available to us, there will be times when we're going to experience flooding.
Agreed.
Well, the storm to me appeared to be at least as bad as Isabel, and perhaps in places Floyd. So comparatively speaking, I would even go as far as to say it was Floyd.
Particularly central and south central parts of the city, I think.
Correct. But what I'd like to get across, it's important that the public call us at Public Works Call Center 269-2700 so that we get every call and we know exactly who's called and can get to the residents.
Okay, so whether it's related to this event that we're talking about or one that happens in the future, that's the best way to get it into the system so we have a comprehensive knowledge of what people have experienced. So over time, our teams can figure out what that was and whether, in fact, there's anything we can do about it or not.
Correct. Excellent.
All right. Gentlemen, I thank you for joining me today, and please pass on my thanks to the outstanding Public Works and Engineering staff that have helped us through these difficult days.
Thanks, Neil.
When the wrong place at the wrong time just happens to be right where you are, you muscle through it and help others come out stronger. That's something everybody's got, a little thing called heroism. Volunteer some of yours at readyhamptonroads.org.
Joining me now is Fire Chief Scott Liebolt. Scott has the oversight of our Emergency Operations Center, which unfortunately had to be used during the great unnamed storm of August 25th to August 28th. Scott, we've talked about the specifics of the drainage and flooding response from Public Works and Engineering. I wanted to spend a minute having you tell the citizens about kind of the larger emergency response, particularly on Saturday and then once again, unfortunately, Tuesday night. Could you just talk a little bit about what the fire department and the emergency forces in general experienced and what they did?
Sure. On Saturday, as the rain started to fall and it became evident that it was not going to let up, all of the emergency responders in the city, to include fire, police, park rangers, sheriff's deputies, all have areas in their response districts that are known problem areas that are potential to flooding. So we kind of focus on those areas. And about 7:30, it became evident with the tide high, with the amount of rain coming in, that we were going to have problems. So the emergency response contingent in the city has basically two main priorities. One is response, one is then recovery. So as far as response, as we start to really get a feel for what's going on, we start to mobilize our resources and really start to plan out what's going to happen. Now, our field supervisors do a really good job of dealing with those single events, the single house fire, the single accident. But when we get a situation where the whole city is impacted, then we've only got so many resources to go around. So we've got to kind of triage how we respond and what we respond with. On Saturday, with the significant rains, we had 6 apartment complexes that became impacted and the residents wanted to be evacuated. Well, we've only got so many people to go around. So as we determine where the priorities are and how we determine who gets response first, who gets response second, we're also thinking down the road, what do we do with these folks when we get them out? So
That's when you called me.
that's when I called you. So while the field supervisors, police, fire, sheriff, are all working on the immediate danger and trying to make sure people have a safe haven, we stop and think about, okay, what do we do for the next 8 hours, the next 10 hours, the next day, the next 2 days, whatever the situation dictates. So that's where we start thinking about the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center.
And if I'm remembering events right, you basically made a somewhat ad hoc decision that it was time for some of us to head to the EOC and sort of create a little bit of a central command post for dealing with what was becoming an increasingly complicated incident.
That's correct. The police chief was out with some of his staff, and based on what he had seen, he called me. We had a small conference. We had already talked to some other folks, and we made the decision that it would be better if we were all in the same place to have the same conversation, to really get a good pulse on what was going on and what we anticipated to happen going forward.
One of the things real quickly, if you could explain how this was different than if a hurricane had been forecast and we had 3 or 4 days to talk about what we were going to do. This was a case of deciding to open the EOC, a partial activation, when we weren't even sure who could get out of their neighborhoods to get there.
Right, this was a no-notice event. It would be very typical if a tornado touched down or something happened with no notice. With a hurricane, we have 2 or 3 days to pre-plan, pre-stage, and determine who's going to respond, where they're going to respond.
Call up extra staff.
Call in extra staff. That was not available to us, so we had to be flexible enough to figure out what we could do with the folks that we could get our hands on.
Chief, you mentioned that the second part of an emergency response is the follow-up work after the immediate crisis is over. discuss what you guys in fire are doing and what other parts of the city organization continue to do the hard work of the follow-up from the storm.
Any recovery requires the opportunity to look back at what we did well, what we can do better. So we always do a debrief. We look at the shelter operations to see if there are efficiencies we can gain by pre-positioning equipment, making sure contact rosters are up to date, those things. As was discussed earlier, Public Works and Engineering are looking at customer complaints and trying to address those to see if there's any rapid fixes for those to prevent a recurrence or anything long-term that they can do planning for in the future. And as far as the public infrastructure that was damaged, the city staff will be working for the next several months, working with the Virginia Department of Emergency Management to see if there's any financial recovery that we can gain to help pay for the restitution of the damage and replacing the systems that were damaged and things that were lost.
And in fact, we have a preliminary estimate of about $2 million of damage to public infrastructure, primarily pump stations and a little bit of road damage.
Correct.
Well, I just want to say in front of all the citizens that are watching, what a great job you, the fire department, all the emergency personnel, the police department did on a no-notice event. And I know a lot of citizens were, frustrated and concerned. They had property damage and saw their cars damaged and that type of thing. But I hope everybody realizes what a great staff response we had in a very difficult situation. And thank you very much personally for your help on a not very pleasant Saturday. And once again on Tuesday night when it hit again in the southern part of the city. Talk about the shelter situation. We're very reluctant to open a shelter. We want to do it when we really need to help our citizens, but it's very disruptive and very expensive to open a school a few days before school's getting ready to open. Talk just real quickly about how that went down.
Well, the decision to shelter came about when we realized how many displaced residents we were going to have. We knew we were going to have to condemn apartments. They would not be able to go back to them. And we have, somewhat of a moral ethical obligation to try to ensure they've got safe haven.
Right.
It's not the Ritz, but it's going to be a dry place where they can work out arrangements. If they've got family members or friends they can stay with, it gives them a dry place to work through that kind of stuff.
And the reality is it takes us about 4 or 5 hours to stand up a shelter at a school.
At a minimum.
And so what we did was we temporarily put people at the Midtown Brittingham Community Center and then moved those who had no other place to go to Warwick High School. Fortunately, the sheltering operation only lasted about 48 hours. Scott, again, I want to thank you for coming and helping to explain to our residents how we responded to this fairly significant no-notice event. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank some of the other departments and the staff of the city government that responded. In particular, in addition to fire, police, I want to acknowledge Human Services and Parks and Rec for their work standing up the shelter, both temporary and otherwise, and also Codes Compliance that was out all day Saturday and Sunday trying to get as many people as possible back in those apartments once the floodwaters receded. Most of all, I want to thank our citizens and businesses for their patience and cooperation during this difficult time as the city staff has done its best to respond to this no-notice and quite significant storm event. Thank you very much.
In response to the August floods, the National Weather Service in Wakefield, Virginia, gave Newport News TV this statement. In responding to these August floods, the City of Newport News stayed true to its values of commitment, caring, and collaboration. An event like this reinforces how important weather warnings and alerts are in helping us be ready. Let me introduce you to the organization that is responsible for making those calls.
Well, I think it's a challenge anywhere to try and get folks to understand and take a threat from their head and put it into their heart. Once you stick that threat here, then you're more likely to act on it. And that's a difficult thing to do because more often than not, you're not severely impacted by an event. But as we saw with the derecho, the thunderstorm wind event, we can have a really, really big impact from something that's not a tornado or a hurricane. So folks, that ought to, in some respects, be a wake-up call to folks to say, maybe I do need to pay attention at more events than just the hurricane or the winter storm, because they could have a significant impact on me, especially with regard to long-term power outages. Our office is one of 120 plus offices that serve local areas around the United States, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam. And our job is to issue forecasts on a day-to-day basis, but more importantly, we issue watches and warnings for a wide variety of weather hazards. We're a 24/7 operation. You know, Mother Nature doesn't sleep, we don't sleep either. So yes, we're running 3 shifts a day for the various forecast staff that work here. Well, the one thing that's happened over the last 15 years is the Weather Service has made a commitment to trying to keep up technologically. And we've done a pretty good job of that. The displays that we have for our model data, for our radar data are, you know, as good as we've ever had. And so our ability to do what we need to do is really as good as it's ever been. The weather that people see on, for example, Wavy or News Channel 3 or WVEC, a lot of the data that they see every night on those weathercasts comes from us. Not all of it, but a lot of it does. And so there is a dependency there on them for a lot of the data that we provide, not only to TV stations, but also to anybody else in the world, for that matter, because a lot of it's available on the internet. And we do work closely with them, because having them there and being able to not only relay the information to the public, but also to be able to show instantaneous radar information to support that really goes a long way, I think, to people protecting themselves in the event of a tornado or severe thunderstorm.
Likely producing winds in excess of 60 miles per hour.
Doppler radar is probably the sort of flagship piece of technology that a lot of folks are aware of. That's right outside the door here. I like to call it the soccer ball on the tower. It's really our lifeblood when it comes to any situation where there's precipitation on the radar, but certainly if there's severe thunderstorm situation, tornado situations, even a flash flood situation, having that radar there and its capabilities is crucial to what we do. What you see around me here in the workstations, those are our primary ways that we do the job that we do, not only for monitoring weather and analyzing potential forecast parameters and forecast models, but also to actually mechanically producing the forecast. We don't sit down and type forecasts anymore. We're as much graphical artists as we are forecast typists, and so there's as much art as science anymore. But there are things that we can do in a graphical environment that we can't do in a text environment. Things like the land-water interface, which can be crucial, not only to people living near the water, but a mariner whose livelihood is dependent upon the water. There are things that we can do in a graphical framework that we can't do very well in a text framework. There are other pieces of technology that are important to us. NOAA Weather Radio is critical to us as a means of getting information out to the public in a push format. It's a 24-hour weather broadcast, but when we issue watches and warnings, those radios tone alert within about typically 30 seconds of the time we send the product here. Our core mission as an agency is to protect lives and property, and the ability to get warnings, for example, like tornado warnings and severe thunderstorm warnings out in sufficient time to allow people to take shelter, to protect themselves, protect their families, I think is really critical. And while we're not perfect at that, we are far better at it than we were even 15 or 20 years ago. And those improvements are only going towards saving more lives and protecting more property.
Thanks for watching this special edition of Newport News in Review. Stay tuned if you need more information.